Good morning. It's a pleasure to have here today Barbara. Barbara got her PhD from MIT, and she started working at Boston University in 1996, where she is now an associate professor with appointments in the Department of Cognitive and Neural Systems. For those who don't know that department, that's Steve Grossberg's department at BU. Plus others, but I think it's fair to say that Steve really. She also has appointments in the biomedical engineering department, Harvard, MIT Health and Science Technology program. She has appointments many places, you know. And we'll keep this short. She also serves on the board of Boston University Center for Neuroscience and the board of directors for Celeste. That's their BU Center of Science of Learning. It's one of the 5 NSF centers in the science of learning. And she's got many awards. I'm not going to list them. I'm going to just say one award that she got recently. She got one of the 5 or 6 inaugural awards from DoD. I mean, it's the equivalent of the career awards, but from DoD. And it's a pleasure to have her here. I've known her for various corrections as we go, and I'm sure you guys will enjoy her talk.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate you being here. And I have to say, I also appreciate the fact that I was very inflexible in my travel plans and at the last minute changed. And so I want to thank you for being understanding about all of that. So what I want to do today is to talk about how we understand speech in complex everyday settings that typically have more than one source. So the setting that you're in right now, where I'm basically the only loud thing going on other than my cell phone ringing right now, which I'll ignore. I'll turn that off. Other than that. Is that on you? Yeah, exactly. No. But the thing is, all the time we're interrupted. All the time in everyday settings, when someone is talking to you or when you're trying to understand something, there are other sounds that interrupt, that can mask portions of what you're hearing. And what we've been trying to do in my lab is understand what the processes are that help you and process and understand speech in those kinds of settings. And so the title of the talk is Understanding Speech in the Face of Competition, like you might find in everyday settings. Now, I often try and jam too much into my talk, so I want to start by acknowledging some of the people that are whose work I'll talk about. So this is Errol Osmerol, who's about to start a PhD program at UNC. But he's been in the lab for 5 years and did his master's in the lab, did an undergraduate thesis in the lab, and has been working in the lab for the last few years. Jin Best is a former postdoc who's about to come back to BU because she missed us so much, and she's been very instrumental in a lot of the work. Antje Illefeld is a student, now a postdoc, but a lot of her PhD work is going to be discussed today. And then Ross Maddox, who just called me for God knows what reason, is also involved in one of the studies. He's a biomedical engineering student at BU. So one of the things that's kind of interesting in psychoacoustics is we have studied as a field a lot about what happens if you're trying to understand some sound and it's masked, but it's masked in a very particular way. It's masked by some other sound that's very dissimilar from it, like noise. And the equivalent visually is sort of like this. The equivalent analogy is there's some interesting thing out there that you're trying to listen to and understand, but there's something else that's making it less audible, or in the case of vision, the contrast is reduced because it's masked. But in this sort of situation where you have speech-shaped noise as a masker and you're trying to understand speech, the analogy visually is like this. And the idea is that anything that's interesting in that scene that you're trying to understand is the target that you're trying to understand, because the structure of the masker is very different than the structure of the sound that you're trying to understand. So if there's anything important in that scene, if there's any interesting feature in that scene, you know to ascribe it to the target. And the only real problem with understanding is being able to detect those features that convey the meaning. And we do understand a lot about that kind of problem. That's, like I said, it's been studied to death in the field of psychoacoustics. So we understand the auditory representation at the periphery and how masking works, more or less, for this kind of signal. But in a lot of cases, that's not the problem that you really face. A lot of the time, the problem is much more analogous to something like this. I'm trying to pick up my son, and the problem is he's embedded in a scene where there are lots of other clowns just like him or very similar to him. And my problem is not that he's invisible or obscured by these other things. It's that I don't know which one of these really interesting things is the right one, and I have to look through the scene to find him in that scene. And so here he is, embedded in this scene, and that is a very different problem. You can see his face is not covered in any way. Every feature is visible, but there are lots of other features that are very similar to it and are exciting and interesting, and your brain is attracted to in the same sort of way. So the same sort of thing can happen in the auditory world, we think, and we think that that's a lot of the problem. And it turns out the field of vision is way ahead of us in understanding these processes when this is the kind of problem you face. And really crudely speaking, if you look in the neurophysiology and if you look in the psychophysics, in the visual domain, if I give you some feature and tell you where to put your attention, you can solve this problem pretty easily. And so if I visually tell you, here's the target, that's my other son, Will, I tell you to look there, the effect is almost as if the brain is turning down the representation to all the competing objects that are the wrong things, that allows you to analyze that thing that you're trying to attend in greater detail. So we've been looking at that same sort of thing in the auditory domain and trying to understand these sorts of processes, and we're pretty convinced that they're very analogous. If you understand the way information is encoded in a speech signal or in an acoustic signal and can step back and abstract a little bit from what people have done in vision, there really are very analogous processes operating. And so one other thing that has really driven a lot of what we do is there's a lot of evidence in the visual domain that when you attend to something, be it a color or a location, what gets pulled into the foreground of your processing is not just that color, but the object that's associated with that color. So if you direct vision to a particular point in space, say if if I point to your attention to the corner here, the whole attached piece of table, I guess, I don't quite know what that is, would get drawn into your foreground. And so what that really implies then is that how you form an object is going to really affect how well you attend to things in a real world situation. So to selectively attend to something, you have to somehow be able to form objects in order to do this sort of process. So the idea is the brain is going to automatically group things into objects, and what that really means is the brain is trying to decide what things go together, what sound belongs together as coming from some source out there in the external world. It will group that together as automatically as it can, and then listeners are going to perceive that as an object and can attend to that. And so what this really means is that there's going to be some intricate link between object formation and how attention is going to operate in everyday settings and the kinds of interference you're going to be able to see psychoacoustically in such settings. So you can kind of make some nice visual analogies of this kind of problem. Here's an example of a big blob of black letters that are hard to process. And they're hard to process because there are a bunch of different words that make up that blob, but the letters making up that blob run together. They aren't distinct from one another. It looks like one mass of letters. And that's kind of analogous to a failure of object formation. There's not enough structure in that scene because I constructed it artificially so that different words look similar. Your brain therefore groups it as one thing, and that interferes with the ability to process each of those words because you see it as one unitary thing. If I were to do something like change the colors are a feature that your brain uses automatically to group things. And so when, that's very fun. So the brain will automatically group things by color, and you can see it's grouping things by color. Unfortunately, the group boundaries that are created by the color are not the right boundaries for the words. So again, that gets in the way of how you're going to process things, because you can attend to the dark blue or you can attend to the red, but that doesn't really help you process the words. It takes real effort. If, on the other hand, I'm going to just go back to black, if I just make the colors line up with the word boundaries, then all of a sudden it gets much, much easier to process each word in turn, to focus on one at a time, and to understand the meaning. So that's sort of a quick kind of crude demonstration of this kind of principle, that your brain is going to break things up into pieces, and the pieces are going to be the thing that you attend one at a time. Now, that means that which piece you attend, which object you attend, is a whole nother problem. So there's things out there in the world, there's objects out there. How do you select which object? How do you know which object is the one you want to process? because that's also a form of interference. If I don't know that my son is in a particular position in the image, I'm going to have trouble selecting that image, his image from the larger scene. So proper selection relies on a whole bunch of things. To do that, you need to have the object form properly and be distinct from the other things, but you also have to know what distinguishes that object, be it a location in space, be it a color. You need some feature to help you pull out the right thing, or you're going to be forced to go from one thing to another in the scene, serially, essentially, to find the thing that you're interested in. And so what that really, another thing that's kind of interesting is the way attention works is not all based on what you want. Some of it's based on the features of the scene itself. So if a really loud door slams behind you, everyone will jump and turn almost automatically. Even if that's not the focus of your attention, even that's not what you're volitionally trying to do. And that happens because some things are more salient than other things inherently, and there's constantly a balance between the input and how salient things are in the input stream and what you're trying to attend, what you're trying to listen to or look for in a scene. And those things balance out in funny ways. So here's an example of that. In this kind of picture, the word bottom up jumps out at you. It jumps out because it's more salient, and it's more salient for a couple of reasons. It's darker in its intensity. It's a different color than anything else in the scene. And that kind of thing makes it pop out of the scene. And you're drawn to that. Now, you could read each of the other words in turn if you want to, but naturally your eyes are drawn to that very salient thing. You have to overcome that volitionally by directing attention elsewhere. But you can do that. For instance, if I direct your attention visually to a location, I can get you to look elsewhere. So if I give you an arrow cue and tell you to look in the bottom left corner, suddenly you very easily can read the word top down. That's kind of a demonstration of you deciding what to process and focusing attention on the thing that you want based on some feature that you know. So that's the kind of thing that happens in vision. The question is what happens in the auditory world. And like I said, we've become very convinced over the last 5 years or so that very similar processes take place in the auditory domain. So I'm going to give you an example now of a very simple scene. It's got two things going on at once. There's going to be a phone number that starts, and your job is to listen to the phone number and remember the numbers, because I'm going to ask somebody to tell me what the phone number is at the end. So it's a metallic, it's a processed speech sound, it's monotonized, so you're going to be listening for this metallic sounding monotonous version of a telephone number. So everybody listen.
3 5 3 4 3 4 2.
So who volunteers? Anybody get it? It's a little loud, but you are the most shy audience I've ever had. Elmer.
3 5 3 4 3 5 2.
Anybody? He was off by one digit. 4 2. Exactly. Now it turns out that's the phone number. That phone number stands out because it's very different than the other voice, and you had no problem hearing out the number.
3 5 3.
So there it is by
3,
itself.
4 2.
And that's the phone number of my good friend Steve Colburn, for those of you who ever want to call Steve Colburn at BU. The phone number 617 plus that will get you Steve. Okay, now here's the other fun question. Who can tell me anything at all about the other sound that was in that mixture? Was it a dog barking? Anything? It was not a dog.
Female voice.
It was a female voice. Yes, it was. Anybody, anything else? It actually was me. It was actually me saying something. Now I'm going to play exactly the same mixture. No tricks here. Exactly the same mixture, but listen for my voice in the same mixture.
3 5 3 4 3 4 2.
That is the magic of attention. And you can do it in the visual domain very easily if you go on the web and search. There are all sorts of demos of this. Andreas?
But didn't you prime us to listen?
Absolutely. I played all sorts of tricks.
I
can tell you, and to be
couldn't
fair-
hear your voice at all, you know?
To be fair, absolutely I did. And I also was very evil, because what did I do? I gave you a phone number. Why is a phone number bad? What does a phone number demand of you? It demands memory, and how much context is there? About 0.
Nothing.
Right? So I forced you to listen attentively to every single syllable in that utterance. I definitely rigged this. But it does demonstrate the issue that when you're focused on one thing, and it's a hard listening task, you do push down the representation of everything else. And we've done some other studies that I don't have time to talk about today, looking at what happens if you play two things at once and your job, the listener's job, is to report both. And you know what we find is that it seems like what you do is you alternate attention between them and use memory. But really, in the foreground at one moment, at any one moment, it seems like only one thing is really in the foreground. So we see very different effects on the high priority item in a two-source mixture versus the low priority item. It's a very different game because you basically what happens is for a short burst of words, you listen to one attentively and then use memory, we think, to recall the second. So this was definitely a stacked example. I'm not going to try and pretend that it's always this extreme. But I used context, a lack of context to force you to listen attentively. I made it sound like it was going to be hard, so you really focused, and you get this kind of effect. But we see effects like this even in other cases where you're trying to listen to both things. So the idea, we come away from all of this really convinced that you listen attentively to objects, and that the object that you listen to is only one thing. Now, the other thing that gets a little funny and I think plays out a little differently in the auditory domain compared to the visual domain. In the visual domain, objects tend to be very easily separated compared to in the auditory domain. In the auditory domain, it's much more of a grayscale. So this example was also rigged in the sense that the two voices were very, very distinct, very dissimilar, and it was easy to squelch the wrong one. There are other cases where that's not true, and in fact,
How do you know that you don't analyze both perfectly well but remember only one?
so we played games with that by, I'm trying to remember how we do different controls. So one thing that happens is if we degrade the speech, then the low priority item takes a bigger hit than the high priority item. And then we can play games. I just was looking at some data yesterday. So it's a great question, and we've been worrying about that. I just saw some data from Jin Best yesterday where we degraded the low priority item and not the high priority item, and looked at, as a function of the degradation, at what happens to the low priority item, and then flipped it. And it's very asymmetrical. So there are things like that. It's indirect evidence, granted, but it really seems like that's what's going on. I mean, our best explanation for the data we have today. But it's a great question, and we don't know for sure that that's what's going on. It's our working hypothesis. So to jump back here for a second, and by the way, please do interrupt. I love interruptions like that. That makes it much more fun. So we think you're listening to one thing, but it is more grayscale in the auditory domain, and I can construct examples where the two objects that are competing are very similar in a lot of ways, and that makes it harder to separate them, which makes it harder to throw one out. And here's an example of that. So this is another, you're going to have to listen carefully and concentrate. But what you're going to do is listen for the sentence that begins with the word Rachel and report the sentence that starts with the word Rachel. So I'm going to turn down the sound just a little. Here's the sentence. So listen for Rachel.
Rachel prefers two heavy houses.
What's the problem? Anybody? The problem is there's two streams spoken by the same talker. Now, I also, again, rigged this because this is from a corpus where the sentence structure is identical and roughly time-aligned. So there's a noun, or a name, a verb, a noun, et cetera, and they can be interchanged.
What you expected us to hear, because I couldn't understand anything in this case.
Oh, now see, that's interesting. How many people understood it?
I couldn't understand what you said in the other one, and from context, I assume that most people did understand.
Yeah, so
You
we'll
need
get
tell
to...
us after we've heard it.
Here, let me go back. Here's what you didn't hear.
It's hard to understand two things at once.
Was my sound in that mixture. And if I come to this, now this gets to another interesting point in a whole avenue
Once
that
I
we're,
was paying attention, I could tell it was your voice.
right.
But I still couldn't
How many
understand
people,
the
when I play this mixture, can understand words?
Rachel prefers two heavy houses.
So it's interesting. It depends on the room environment. So reverberation really hurts this, and this is a fairly large room. The other thing that is really huge in this is aging and presbycusis, aging of the auditory system. And we don't understand that, and it's something we're looking at now. But the few times that people really fail to understand words, because most people hear words, hear syllables and words that are audible and meaningful, but they have trouble sorting them for a young adult listener. That's what happens. But people who are a little bit older, and I'm in my mid-40s, I'm starting to notice this myself. It gets harder and harder a little bit of degradation really hurts in this kind of situation. And that's something we actually are just starting some studies of to try and really get at that. But we think that aging of the auditory system makes every one of the features a little less distinct, which not only hurts understanding speech and quiet, it particularly hurts segregating the sources, which means that you end up with that black mixture, that black blob of lots of things stuck together that aren't really meaningful. So that's an interesting thing. So
is that the memory? Is that the memory related?
We don't think it's memory related. We think it's sensory related, and we think that for a couple of reasons. Hearing impaired listeners have huge difficulties in everyday settings, and reverberation really, really hurts them. We also think that when we look at what happens to a hearing impaired listener and compare that to what happens when a normal hearing, young, healthy listener is in a reverberant setting with lots of reverberant energy off the walls and floors, it's a very, very similar kind of degradation in these tasks. We think that what happens is a sensory representation is smeared a little bit, is less distinct. That interferes with object formation, which then interferes with selective
Hard for
attention.
computers, too.
Excuse me?
It's hard for computers. Reverberant speech is very hard for computers to understand.
Yeah, yeah.
Are
Yeah.
there cases where the reverberation, for instance, like a floor reflection, could actually support the direction?
Absolutely. So the way in which reverberation screws things up really depends on the time scale of the reverberation relative to the time scale of syllables, roughly. And so, at least in quiet. So early echoes generally just boost the overall level of sound without really interfering with intelligibility in quiet. Now, it gets a little more complicated in the case when there's multiple competing sources, because one of the things you want to use to separate sources is spatial cues. The spatial fine structure gets screwed up by reverberation on a much finer time scale, and early echoes really do mess those up. And so that interferes somewhat with that. Andreas?
So, but right, if we were to be outside, so all this relevant stuff would be away, it won't be relevant, and we have two people talking on two sides of the acoustic field,
Yeah.
would it be easier to solve this problem?
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely.
So this problem, why was this particular example here so hard? And I have to get.
Rachel gives two heavy houses.
We actually have a pair of twin undergraduates from BME working in the lab right now, and we were really excited because that's basically what I've done here. Identical twins talking at the same time, sentences that are indistinguishable on the basis of their structure and content. So again, it's a pretty mean trick. Most people in this kind of mixture do hear words, though. And that's because the local spectro-temporal continuity of the sound is enough to form those little groups, that little bursts of energy, correctly into syllables. The problem is there's nothing distinguishing the syllables from one utterance from the syllables of the other utterance across time. If they came from different locations, it becomes a very easy task. If they have different timbre of voice, it becomes an easy task. Anything that gives you this continuity across time allows you to solve this task. So here are the two sentences,
Rachel gives two heavy houses.
along with,
Kathy prefers three pretty spoons.
and you can hear even the F-naught contour of those two utterances is very similar, so that's not a clue to help you tease these apart. So again, it kind of demonstrates, though, you need these features to direct attention, but the features also affect the grouping across time. And if I jump back to vision, when it comes to the visual world, time does not play the same sort of role. Most studies of visual attention use static scenes and do a search task, or they have a rapid presentation over time, which is kind of the RSVP kinds of tasks. They don't include often things that evolve over time in a continuous way like speech. So time plays a slightly different role for speech than it has in a lot of visual studies, and that's actually an interesting thing.
So, there's something else to explain. Why is it, I could understand both eventually.
Because
That's harder, right?
why can you, but did you really understand both, or did you understand neither in the sense?
No, when you played the two separately, that's what I eventually heard after the third playing, you played it.
Right, but the meaning of the sentences, neither meaning probably were you sure you got right, because you heard two sets of words and couldn't tell which verb went with which noun.
I heard you correctly.
Did you? Ah. Well, see, most people don't. I will say these are normal continuous utterances, though. So there is enough feature there that you might be able to solve the problem. Most people find it really hard. And it's kind of interesting. Most people, because I've used this very mixture of sound for about a year and a half, 2 years now, and given this version of this demo, And most people don't get the right answer. I'd say, you know, it's a,
3 times, but I thought this was nonsense, and so how can this be? But that's what I
yeah. But this actually gets to another interesting point, which is in the acoustic literature, in the psychoacoustic literature, people haven't been very precise about differentiating between how things group across time just based on structure, like the continuity of F naught and co-articulatory cues and context cues, things like that, versus how much of it is attention and bringing something to the foreground through directed attention. And those are a little bit distinct. So one of the things I'm going to show you next is a study that kind of tries to differentiate between those. Are there cues that cause things to group together across time on these larger time scales, not the syllable level, but across longer time scales? Or is that all just attention? And we think that both things happen. We think that continuity of pitch or continuity of location cause things to group together automatically into a continuous object across time, but also you can direct attention to those very features to pull out, to select one or another thing from a mixture.
So that would be the same also across spatial location?
If it were continuous?
Yes.
Are you trying to draw the analogy to vision now? I'm not sure.
No, acoustic. I mean, someone is there and is moving, you know.
Yeah, anytime there's continuity of these sorts of features, I think it causes things to group together. If I get to it, I'll show you at the end. I have some data that is interesting that suggests that predictable motion doesn't help very much. So I don't know. I'm a little bit out. The jury's a little bit out on that. But the question, this first study I want to run through, the question that we were asking is, do these high-level features really aid performance even in the absence of attention by allowing you to group things together automatically? So we know that spatial cues, from other studies we've done, we know that spatial cues are really excellent for selecting a source in top-down attention. But the question was, does it help you stream together syllables across time even in the absence of spatially directed attention? So spatial separation between competing sounds can increase perceptual segregation. It may be the case that it could, but which could help you do this kind of separation even if you're not choosing the right thing. It could make them more distinct from one another, or it could only be from top-down attention. So what we did, and this is part of Antje's thesis work, was we had 3 conditions. And there was a cue word, ready, and then there were 2 other words, a color and a number. And the color and the number came in a pair. So there were 2 colors and 2 numbers, and they differed in their timbre, and they differed in their location. So blue 4 had the same color, the same timbre and the same location. Green 6 had the same timbre and location, but differed from blue 4. The cue word ready then either had the same location as one of the 2 streams, had the same timbre and location as one of the 2 streams, or had the same timbre but a different location. And we told people which thing they were supposed to attend. So we blocked these things, and in the timbre condition we said, listen to the timbre of this cue word and then report the things that match it. So the goal here, and then what we did is titrated how much spatial separation there was between these 2 competing streams. So there was very little, up to more, up to more. And so we made the spatial cues bigger and bigger, which we thought might make the 2 sets of words more distinct and separate as objects, even if you were in a timbre condition where you aren't directing attention to space. So here, what I'm going to show you are the errors that people make, because that's really where the story is. So people could do all of the tasks. They could direct attention to timbre or to location or to timbre location. But what was interesting is when they made errors, sometimes what they would do is report 1 word from one stream and 1 word from the other stream. And in those cases, the bigger the spatial separation, the fewer those kinds of errors. So as the spatial separation between between the streams got larger, they were less likely to choose 1 word from one stream and 1 word from the other. And that didn't matter. It didn't matter which kind of feature they were attending. But when we looked at a different kind of error, which is to report exactly the wrong pair of words, those errors went down when people were directing attention to space or directing attention to space and location. But they did not go down if people were not directing attention to space. So what was happening is, when the words were close together, it was like that example I just played you. They had trouble telling which stream was which, and they would intermingle words. as things became farther and farther apart, that intermingling went down no matter what. But if they were using space to select which group of words to report, they got better and better if space was the thing they were using to choose which of these two streams. But even when the two streams were far, far apart, if they were using the timbre to try and select the stream on the left or the stream on the right, it didn't help them that these things were more distinct. It just, they would choose the wrong stream more, equally as often, regardless of the. Yeah, to go into the detail of what we did, this is really highly processed speech. We wanted to reduce the amount of energetic overlap in the speech. So what we did is we used noise vocoded speech. We threw out half of the bands of speech. So half of the low frequency bands were thrown out for one target, for the target. Half were thrown out of the high frequency bands. We intermingled them. And so the timbre here is really a funny timbre cue. Excuse me?
It's not really too natural.
It's not at all natural. And what I'm calling timbre is actually, it's timbre and spectrum and lots of things. But it's for us, that was not really the important thing. The important thing was it was something that you could use, and it wasn't space.
Yeah, I was surprised because you would think that humans are probably pretty good at doing that. And I wondered if it was more natural speech. You know?
No. And the reason they didn't do as well with timbre, for instance. They actually did pretty well with all of the cues, but the reason they didn't do better was in part because these were very unnatural and actually sounded more similar than your voice and my voice would sound.
But then if you were throwing the low frequencies and high frequencies, you probably don't have any pitch quality.
Oh, it's noise vocoded anyhow, so there's no pitch.
Oh.
Yeah, so it's a very funny stimulus. So, but what we concluded from this is that the spatial cues really help segregation as well as selection. So segregation was enhanced by spatial separation, even when people weren't paying attention to space, even when they were using timbre to select the words. And you can see that by the fact that there were fewer intermingling errors as the sources became farther and farther apart. On the other hand, selection of the correct group of words was enhanced by spatial separation only if you were directing attention to the spatial attribute. So there was no reduction in how often you reported the wrong stream as things got farther and farther apart if space wasn't the very feature that told you which was the right thing. So we did a quick follow-up to this because one of the things that's kind of funny is here the two cues work together. If you go back, in all of these cases, both the location and the timbre was continuous across the set of words all the time. So what we did in this follow-up, was to pit the cues against one another. And this is something that Ross Maddox just did and reported on. So we made the cues opposing. So there was a cue word, and to make the first and second words more equivalent, we used two sets of numbers. So then there'd be a number pair and then another number pair. And we had a whole bunch of conditions that were all intermingled in a block. And so within a block, you didn't know if you were going to get exactly this configuration, but I'm going to show you just the results for this configuration. So sometimes the cue word could have the matching location and timbre of one stream, and the other stream was clearly the wrong stream. This is the case that was opposing, where if you were directing attention spatially, then you should report 2-6. But if you were directing attention to timbre, or to pitch in this case, these were pitch. Again, we used a speech synthesis package to monotonize the speech, gave them different monotonous pitches, and so you were directed either to pitch or location. So here color means pitch. So if you were to report things based on directing attention to space, you should report 2-6, but if you were directing attention to pitch, you should report the other pair 5-9. Now the other thing that could happen though is that streaming based on these cues might be automatic, and then the streaming is also pit against itself. So streaming based on pitch should cause you to group these together, and streaming based on location would cause these to group together. So the question was, can you direct attention to one feature, and what happens, and how does this all play out? Here's some examples. So this is an example of the monotonized pitch. You'll hear two of these numbers with difference in pitch. So 5 cents difference is really nothing. And then 500 cents difference is the largest one we used, and you can clearly hear this big pitch difference.
1-6.
So then what we did, we also varied the direction separation from 10 degrees up to 90 degrees. And so we're varying the strength of these low-level cues to see how that's going to affect grouping and selection. So here's the data, and it's exactly the same stimuli, and they're either attending to location or attending to pitch. So this is the attend location condition. And in blue, I plotted the correct answer. So they're supposed to pay attention to location. The blue plot shows the percent of the time they report the correct number pair from the correct location. Red is a particular kind of error that they make, which is to go with pitch, to report the wrong cue. Yellows are where they report a mixture of words. And then gray are all sorts of other errors. You can see they rarely don't report things that were not in the mixture. They often get the right answer, blue. When they make mistakes, usually they're reporting the wrong thing. They're going with the pitch cue. And most of the remaining errors, if they make any, are just kind of confusions between the words that from pitch and from location. But what you can also see is that there's this effect of pitch. Even though they're directing attention to location and trying to ignore pitch, pitch affects performance. So they get better and better as the cue that they're listening to gets bigger and bigger. But they also get better when the cue that they're trying to ignore gets smaller. And so that's sort of evidence that there's this low-level effect. Even though they're trying to ignore pitch, it's detrimental to them to pay any attention to pitch. They can't. It's affecting their performance. And they tend to make errors of reporting the pitch stream more than anything else.
So
Yeah.
you're arguing here that when we process with streams, anything that pushes us away from the correct stream is really...
It's going to get in the way. It's going to interfere. Now the other thing, though, is what happens when you attend to the other cue? Because maybe this is just a low-level hardwired thing. Maybe there's no effective top-down attention. Maybe you're always going to report this percentage of things. And this is the same exact stimuli, but now your job is to pay attention to pitch. And now the color code is reversed in terms of what you report, because the correct answer is 5-4, not 8-2. 8-2 is an error where you've gone with location rather than with pitch. So look over here. This blue is the time you report 4-5, which is like the red up here. So you can see there's a huge effect of attention. When you're trying to pay attention to pitch, you actually do pay attention to pitch somewhat, but the pitch cue is less helpful to you in this example for the values we chose than the location cue. But you also see, there's much more blue here than here, but the blue here is not at all equivalent to the red in this case. And you see the same sort of pattern that you're going to get better and better as the cue you're attending to gets bigger and bigger, but you see this other effect that most of the errors that you make are errors where you go with the wrong thing, that there's this inherent kind of bias towards grouping things based on these low-level features, even the feature that you know is going to lead you wrong and give you the wrong answer. So what we think is that listeners can direct attention to either of these features, and that changes what they're going to report and what they're going to process. They can either use location or pitch. And here pitch is less effective, but like I kind of hinted, that's kind of an arbitrary choice based on the size of the location differences and the size of the pitch differences. But the errors also show this role of automatic streaming based on these low-level features. Anything that causes things to sound continuous in pitch or in location is going to bias you towards grouping things together across time, even if you're trying to ignore that feature. So you see that top-down selection really affects things, but errors are also, the errors that you make are dominated by reports of the other stream. So we think that this shows that there's streaming based on pitch and location that's automatic even when you're directing attention away from that feature. Yeah?
So, in comparison, pitch and location, which one actually more dominant?
The question was, which is more dominant, pitch or location? And the answer is, I can construct cases where pitch is much more salient than location. If I give you a 5-degree separation in space and an enormous difference in timbre or pitch, it would be the dominant thing. So it's sort of like apples and oranges. I don't think any one thing is the most powerful thing. It depends on the size of the feature. They're different dimensions. And so one could ask that sort of question and try and carefully decide what is the right scaling to go from pitch to location. But there's so many, the other thing that gets a little tricky here is there's so many dimensions that it's hard to really play that game.
And how many people participate in the experiment?
Typically in our studies we have about 6 to 8 subjects. So it's a typical kind of psychoacoustic study as opposed to a psychology study where there are 400 people. But it's a within-subject design, so the same subjects are performing all of the different conditions. Typically what we do is analyze the individual subjects' data and then convince ourselves that every one of the subjects has a very similar pattern. If they were different, I would kind of tell you that. But everything I've told you so far, we see the same pattern across subjects. So, and in fact, the error bars that I showed in this first study way back here, if I get there, so these error bars are across subject standard deviations. So they're very, very conservative. That's why they look so large. Some subjects are better than others, and that is the biggest difference across subjects. All of the effects I'm talking about are statistically significant, especially if you use subject as a within subject kind of design. We can show you that the same pattern holds across subjects. So yeah.
Do these subjects spend some time to practice?
Yeah, we typically give them a half an hour at least of practice, make sure that they understand the task. We typically have multiple days that they come back to do the tasks. We monitor to make sure that there's not large effects of learning. But we also always counterbalance. Every day that they come in, they do all conditions. So if there's any overall learning, it will happen across the board, and that will just add to the variability in the kind of designs we use. So that's the kind of thing we try and control for as well. Any other questions? So I'm just going to quickly talk about one other study, which is something that is very, very different than what people have looked at in vision. In vision, like I said, most of the studies have looked at static scenes and trying to understand what happens with directing attention in a static scene, or the role of time isn't really looked at in much detail. But what they have shown is that it takes time to switch attention from one thing to another. And in fact, Steve Yentis, who couldn't be here, a lot of his work was very influential on me in thinking about this, because some of his stuff in fMRI is very nice in showing this time that it takes to switch attention and trying to identify the parts of the brain that are involved in that switching of attention from one thing to another. So we were kind of intrigued by that because vision studies show that it takes time to switch attention. And we know from auditory studies that it takes time in a typical auditory scene to form an object. So if selective attention depends on how you form an object, maybe that is another factor that's going to affect how you selectively attend. Maybe if I selectively attend to something across time, I'll get better and better as I become more and more sure of how to form the object, how to segregate it from the other sources. So we were interested in this, and what we did is we created, again, a really crazy, artificial, nasty thing. We had a listener sitting in front of an array of 5 speakers that were separated every 15 degrees. Each loudspeaker presented a sequence of digits, 4 digits in a row, so there are 5 different digits on at one moment in time. So there are 20 digits, 5 speakers, 4 time slots. The different fonts and colors is used to show you that the talker differed in each one of those. And that was something we looked at, is the effect of the talker. But in general, different talkers were coming out of each of the speakers at different time instances. And the job of the listener was to pay attention to one speaker at one instant in time and report a 4-digit sequence. And what we did is we had LEDs that kind of lit up on top of the loudspeaker and over time would jump from one to another to another to another. So the listener's sitting there and they hear this sequence of 5 things and their attention has to jump in space from one to another over time. And the mixture is 5 simultaneous digits. So it's a really hard task. It's a really nasty mixture. And then what we did is we varied the timing between the digits and also the timing of the lights relative to the digits. So in the control case, the location was fixed across time. So that's kind of listening to one source in one location across time. So the lights would come on, and they knew it was going to be it was a block design, so they knew in that block, once something comes on, I'm going to just stick to that location. In the switching, synchronous, the light came on at the instant that the sound was presented, but it could jump around in space. And then we had a third condition where the light came on ahead of time and warned the listener, here's where your next target's going to be, move attention to here, and report this sequence. And then we varied the time between the digits. So this is just the overall data. The inter-word delay went from 0 up to a full second. And this is performance in the easiest case where the thing was fixed. So you're just paying attention to one stream of 4 digits from one location, and you get this level of performance, and it didn't really matter what the interword delay was. It wasn't a big effect. Now we look at what happens when you switch. So the thing is jumping around, and you don't have any warning. You have time between the digits, so if there's any memory load or stuff like that, you're going to have some time as things get longer. You have more and more time to process things maybe, but you don't have time to know where that's going to come from. And you can see there's no real effect, but you do take this hit. You're worse, and again, these are across subject error bars. Within subject, the effects are very, very strong. There's a big hit going from a fixed location to having it jump in space. But then what we did is turn the light on ahead of time, and up to a whole second ahead of time. We figured that would really help. If the real problem is just switching attention, and it just takes time to move attention from one source to another, a second's a long time. Typically, people talk on the order of 200 to 500 milliseconds for that sort of switching of attention. So we figured you'd get some recovery from this cost of switching attention. But in fact, you didn't at all. In fact, the cost did not go away. And when we broke things down, oh, I forgot. So we also compared what happens if the voice, the target voice, is fixed. So what I showed you originally was when the target voice is actually changing from digit to digit. What happens when the target voice is continuous? It's the same talker who's the target. And in fact, that helped you even more. But it helped you in particular in those 2 cases where the words were close together in time, either with no gap between them or a pretty brief gap of 250 milliseconds between them. That's where it really helped you. And there's a lot, what we think is going on is in those cases, because the gaps are short, it sounds more natural and more continuous as one stream. When the gap got too long, it really didn't sound like a continuous stream of speech. It sounded like disjoint words. And so you didn't get the across-time effect as strongly in that case. But what we also did is looked at as a function of the digit position in the stream. So this is the 4 different inter-word delays. And then we looked at how well you did on each of the digits, digit number 1, number 2, number 3, and number 4. When the source stayed fixed in location, what happened was you got better over time. As you maintained attention on one location, you got better over time. And you can look at it this way, or I can, and that particularly was true when the delay was short. You can also look at it normalized relative to performance on the first digit. So this is how much better did you get. And you can see you got much better over time, especially when the things were close together in time and were continuous perceptually. But you saw this sort of improvement when things were fixed in space. When things moved in space, the reason you were bad was not because you didn't do very well on the first digit, but because you didn't get this benefit of maintaining attention. It wasn't really a big cost of switching attention. It was a cost associated with not getting better when you maintained attention on one thing. And giving you warning ahead of time didn't really help you, because it wasn't this switching cost that was the dominant effect. It was this loss of improvement over time. And the final piece to all this is, why did that happen? It happened because people got more and more refined in directing spatial attention. So what we did is we broke down the errors. When people reported the wrong digit, we looked at what did they report and looked at how far away from the correct location was the word that you selected in space. So it could be 1 speaker off, or 2, or 3, or 4. And what you see is it's sort of a spatial filter. You tried to answer the right thing, and usually you were right, but when you were wrong, you most often reported something that was right next to the correct place. And you were less likely to report something that was far, far away. But that was particularly true when things were in a fixed location. When things jumped in space, you were less refined in your spatial filtering of the scene. And the final piece to all of this is, if you look just at the fixed digits, what happens is from digit to digit to digit, you got better at refining, selectively refining your spatial filter. And that's shown here. You can see the grayscale kind of shows you which digit you're listening to. At the beginning, the light gray is the first digit down to the dark gray, and you can see as people maintained attention on a fixed location in space, they got more and more refined and more selective, and were making fewer of these errors of adjacent positions. Yeah, Munya.
When you gave people the prior warning, shouldn't they do at least as well as the first digit in the fix?
They actually They more or less do. I'm just trying to. So the question was, when you give them the first. So they should be around this level of performance, and they kind of are near that level of performance. So you're exactly right. So basically, each digit, when you're jumping in space, each digit is a new event, a new object, and you have to direct attention to this new object, and it's kind of a crude attentional filter. But if I can maintain attention and the attributes are fixed across time, I get more and more refined and better. And that's particularly true. The other thing that's kind of cute about it is that's particularly true when I have the same voice compared to a different voice. And it's particularly true when that same voice is close together in time, so it sounds like a continuous stream. So anything that makes it group automatically and stream automatically allows you to focus attention more and more over time on those specific features that define that object in that scene.
And is the argument there that when you use disjoint words that you lose your attention, so we're better at continuous speech than we are at individual syllables?
I think that's, I would say yes. So the idea is when somebody starts talking at a cocktail party and I have to move to direct attention to them because they're the new thing, I might not get that first word very well, but I'll hone in on them very rapidly. I mean, this is just 4 syllables, right? So very rapidly I'll hone in on them and get a little more refined at hearing them and more precise in listening to them in that mixture.
So, of course, in all of the, I think this is great. I mean, but I think what's missing is context. I mean, just words. We are not really. This is not a natural setting, I think.
Yeah. So the point is, with these artificial examples, I can demonstrate this matters. But how much does it really matter in the cocktail party? I think the answer to that, you're right. So we've been doing some, and we're worried about that. And we've done some studies very recently where there's a lot of context. For instance, studies where there's an ongoing sentence, and then sometime later, in the middle of that sentence, you're going to listen for a new stream of digits. And we use digits, so there isn't context in the probe words that that the listener's listening for. What we find is that we do see differences in that kind of task, because now context alone is enough to help you select the right thing out. But what we also find is when we degrade the scene by adding reverberant energy, for instance, then these same things start to matter again, even though they don't matter if it's a really clean mixture. I'm really pretty good at doing the selection and segregation. Anything that messes you up, like hearing impairment, reverberation, anything that makes the scene less distinct, these things start to become important again.
So I guess what you just said, because kind of with my next question, is that perhaps context really helps you with the word recognition, you know.
Oh, absolutely.
And in that way, it will help. But you know, when that degrades, you know, then again you really.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, another piece to all of this, we've done some stuff with phonemic restoration where we obliterate part of a word and replace it with different things and look at, so that clearly is a huge factor here, right? In the real world, you're using context all the time, not just to select the right object, which is what I've been focusing on, not just to segregate the object, but it also, the context helps when you miss things. So you don't need to hear every single syllable that because you know there was a verb there and it was either speak or say, or you know the meaning. You don't care what the exact word is. And so context is really critical. Context matters at every level, from segregation to selection to meaning. So that is another factor. Yeah.
So is the listener allowed to direct their head, or do you maintain a head position?
So typically, if the study is a free field study, and I was really loose and casual about this, but the last study was a free field study with real loudspeakers. They had a headrest. They were told to direct their head straight. We didn't control eye position, but we're more and more convinced that there is going to be an eye position effect. So they could direct their eyes. I can tell you personally, when I'm in that very setting, I direct my eyes to the light to try and help me focus attention, and it really feels like it helps. But we've kind of felt like if we can get that effects that show up and are statistically significant without worrying about that, all the better. So we haven't controlled for that sort of thing. We think it's important. There are studies, a lot of the studies, the first 2 studies I reported were actually headphone studies where we used head-related transfer functions over headphones. So they could move their head, which might screw up things not sounding like they were in the external world, but the spatial cues that they were getting were fixed across time. It didn't depend on head position.
So have you thought about actually measuring spatial filters, turning the same sort of task with more of a localization task?
That's exactly one of the tasks. So Jen Best is really interested in that spatial filter idea in particular. She's particularly interested in the hearing impaired and has been doing some localization studies with normal and hearing impaired to see if that relates to the refinement of selectivity. So is it just that if you have a bad spatial percept, will that make you less refined, and what's the relationship there? So yes, that is something we're interested in and we've been thinking about, but haven't really gotten very far yet. But yeah.
I wonder if part of the case of refinement that you're showing here is because you're cueing attention cross-modally. So have you tried using like a beep at the correct stream?
Yeah, and it gets really, really interesting. So we've tried a beep. We've tried we think that it's kind of the continuity of the object that matters. So what we did is played, we call it the wah-wah experiment. It's exactly this experiment, but the voice of the talker that you're going to have to listen to says wah, wah, wah in between syllables. And it turns out auditory cues are better than visual cues at doing this, directing attention. And we also compared what happens if you have both, the light and the wah-wahs. You do best when you have both. And so it seems like it's some combination of these things. So the cross-modal attention.
Does the refinement speed up as a result of removing the cross-modality?
I can't answer that because we haven't analyzed the data yet. I've only seen the gross overall results so far. I'm trying to think, is that true? No, I have seen that we didn't look at the spatial filter plots yet. But there is a buildup of attention in all cases, and one of the mysteries that we were trying to track down is that buildup and how big it is in one case versus another. The only other thing I'll say, and with respect to this study, one of the other things we tried, and it gets to Andreas's question earlier, is what happens if the listener knows what the trajectory is going to be? It's going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, or it's going to go 1, 3, 5, 2 for a whole block. Turns out that doesn't help you at all. Smooth trajectories do not help you. Knowing what the trajectory is does not help you. It looks, if you're, as I said to the student who had the misfortune of doing that study, if you're going to get a negative result, this is about as beautiful as you can hope for because the data are just on top of one another. So it really seems like it's this cost of attention. So look at this.
I did play the card, but I think we.
Yeah.
So, any other questions? Yeah.
In hospitals, you compound all of the parameters that you mentioned. You have reverberation because you can't use normal absorption. Speech communication is the main delivery system, and there is noise.
Oh yeah.
You separated this, but are you going to look at compiling these together and see what the effects are? It's nice to pick them apart and say, okay, these cues
can help you.
Right? But what happens if you mesh all of these things together?
That's a great question, and we haven't really done that, and the reason is the typical reason for someone in psychoacoustics. I'm just trying to understand the processes at this point. And one of the problems that I see is every single thing you change will make the difficulty of the problem different. So defining what is the typical setting that you want to test is a really under-constrained problem. So if I have all male doctors, that's very different than if I have nurses, lots of male doctors and lots of female doctors, or a mixture. If I have an open corridor that opens into the operating room or into the room, that'll be very different. Everything that changes the competition between sources and the distinctness of the sources is going to change how people perform. Every single factor. And so I could try and quantify it, but it would be a lifelong effort because there's so many, so.
If I may say something to add to that. Actually, this is really great. That's why we have Barbara here, because she gave us some hints on really how to improve, the performance of systems that we build, including speech technology and all that. So this is really going back and putting them in a system and really testing it for different scenarios, such as a hospital or something. That would be a really exciting project anyway. So for all the people to get ideas and work in their lifetime. So I think let's.
Thank you.